Alright, welcome to our lecture on how local and popular cultures can be seen in the cultural landscape. The slides were designed to accompany the textbook People, Places, and Culture, and I am, of course, Ms. Gall, and I'll be your host for the lecture today. So, we start out talking about this, and I'm going to remind you of a few definitions. And these are things that we've already come across and things we've already talked about, but they're useful to remember when we're talking about local and popular culture on the cultural landscape, because they're what remind us of that conflict between the two. So the cultural landscape itself is that visible imprint of human activity on the landscape. So, for example, in our picture here, it's the KFC, it's the McDonald's, it's the parking lot, right? It's the electrical wires, the street lights. That's all part of the cultural landscape, along with several other things, basically anything in that picture. Edward Ralph coined the term placelessness to describe that loss of unique place in the cultural landscape to the point that one place looks like the next. And you see this term used a lot when we're talking about particular American suburbs, but we're going to actually broaden that out a little bit. But this is where we've come across it so far, is talking about suburbs and how oftentimes one suburb will look very much like the next, and they'll offer very similar phenomenon. For example, neighborhoods that all have single-family homes with yards. Most suburbs have the same fast food places. They offer the same types of stores: Target, Kohl's, Walmart. Right? These are things that are very common in American suburbs, and what they do is contribute very much to the idea that one place is a lot like the next. And you kind of see this if you drive even up and down here where we live, drive up and down Highway 99, you can go from one city to another, and not even really recognize the fact that you've left cities, because the landscape doesn't change very much. So that's that idea of placelessness. And it's going to take, it's going to kind of come to the forefront here, because placelessness is what happens when local culture loses out to popular culture on the cultural landscape. So just something to keep in mind. Talk a little bit about popular culture, and then we're going to end our lecture, and we're going to talk about local culture. So got it a little bit backwards in our title there, so that's okay. So we're going to start out, we're going to talk about where we might see buildings over, say, 780 feet tall. So, for example, some places you might expect, right? Chicago, well known for its big buildings. New York, also very well known. Shanghai, pretty well known. Hong Kong, pretty well known, right? Dubai, if you know anything at all about the UAE, you know Dubai is one of those places where they build tall buildings for the sake of building tall buildings. But other places you might not necessarily think about, or that don't necessarily come to mind. Right, so for example, I don't tend to think of tall buildings existing in Saudi Arabia, right, or in Spain or in Germany. And there are a few there, not that many. Or, you know, Moscow, Russia. I've actually been there, and I don't remember there being that many tall buildings there. So just something to keep in mind. And again, we're using tall buildings in this case, buildings 780 feet or taller, as a proxy for popular culture, because that's a cultural landscape item that really gets its start in the U.S. and has spread out gradually across the world. So when we talk about architecture in the cultural landscape, what we're really going to do is talk about kind of how architecture can be used to blend cultural landscape across three major dimensions. So we're going to talk a little bit about architectural forms and planning ideas that have diffused around the world. So architectural forms are things like types of buildings. Skyscrapers are an example of architectural forms. We talk about planning ideas. We talk about, for example, major road systems, like in the U.S. That would be a planning idea. Or the idea that you have functional zonation within cities, that cities control what types of things are built where. That's a planning idea. We're also going to talk about individual businesses and products that have become so widespread that they now leave their distinctive landscape on far-flung places. Great examples of this might be Walmart, for example, got its start over in Arkansas, which is all the way across the country from where we're at in Seattle, but it still leaves its stamp on the local cultural landscape. All right, we talk about McDonald's in much the same way. If we want to talk about products, talk about something like anime or Hello Kitty coming from Japan. Pardon me. The other thing we're going to talk about is the wholesale borrowing of idealized landscape images. And really this, again, promotes a blurring of that place distinctiveness. And I'm going to go ahead and change my slide here to talk about this last one, because it helps to have some visuals. So you would think, you look at the picture here, you think you might be looking at Venice over in Italy, right? Well, you're not. You're looking at the Venetian Hotel Casino in Las Vegas. And Las Vegas is very good at this idea of stealing distinctive cultural landscapes and importing them and then using them for tourist purposes. We see this happening in various places throughout the world. I was reading an article not too long ago talking about places in China that were doing some of the same kinds of things and importing. I think they were talking about like the Eiffel Tower from Paris, importing similar types of architecture with the idea that it kind of, you feel like you're in this other place, right? In the case of the picture, you feel like you're in Venice. You've got the canals, you've got the gondolas and the gondoliers, right? And the old European style architecture. But you don't have to travel there to get that experience. You can just go over to Vegas, right? So, one of the other things we talk about when we talk about this is we got to talk about this idea of a global-local continuum. And continuums, remember, are just basically, when we visualize them, I tend to think of them as long lines, and at each end you have the extremes, right? So when you see the global end of the continuum, that's like what happens all across the world. Okay? When you see the local end of the continuum, what you're really seeing is what happens in your specific city or your specific neighborhood. That's local. And this continuum concept emphasizes, because remember, in continuums, things kind of blur into each other, emphasizes that what happens at one scale is not independent of what happens at other scales. And a great way to think about this is that old Earth Day slogan, think global, act local. Right, so picking up trash in my neighborhood has a global impact in that there's less trash in the environment, and there's less trash flowing around, and now it can be properly taken care of and disposed of. Okay. Or the choices that one city makes in terms of what businesses it allows to grow up and develop in that city has an influence at the global level, particularly if we're talking about businesses like Walmart, for instance, which is working to spread worldwide, or McDonald's, or things like that. Okay? And people in local places tend to mediate and alter regional, national, global processes in a process called localization. So we're taking those processes, those global processes, really, and making them local. A great example we talked about in class with this is when we read the article about McDonald's in France and talked about how very different McDonald's in France is. They still serve burgers and fries like they do here. But they also serve fresh salads, they serve sandwiches on baguettes, they serve bakery goods, things that have only really started to catch on here in the U.S. Okay, so that would be an example of that globalization process. We could also look at, here in Seattle, say something like Five Guys Burgers, which is kind of a, as I understand it, more of a local thing. I've never seen them anywhere else that I've traveled in the U.S. Right. But that's kind of a regional thing. And as it expands, they adjust what they do slightly to suit different markets, right? So, again, that idea that local places mediate what's going on to make it personalized, for lack of a better term. Just to give you some idea of what cultural landscapes for local cultures might look like. If you know anything at all about the settling of the American West, you know that as people moved west, we talk about the Mormons trekking across the country. They get their start in upstate New York, and they make their way through Kansas, and then ultimately, after a bit of a kerfluffle there, they end up in Utah, out by Salt Lake, right? And so if we're talking about the Mormon landscape in the American West, what we end up with is something that's created by founders and early followers of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, right? As they migrate westward under persecution. So what they end up with, which kind of makes sense when you stop and think about they're worried that they might have to fight, is that the settlers cluster in farming villages, and then croplands surround the villages. So it's a little like when you learned about westward migration, pardon pardon me, circling the wagons, right? So that you cluster together the wagons, or in this case, the houses, so that you can protect people by proximity. Okay? And then you've got the open farmland surrounding, which enables you to see anybody who's coming in. And you can see this, and if you look at pictures of this, and they have some in your book, I believe, it's very different than what you tend to think of when you think of farming in the Midwest, where there's these great big farms and the nearest neighbor's 5 miles away, right? And it's very much more rural in that kind of classical traditional sense. So, this has been our lecture talking about how we see local and popular culture in the cultural landscape. We provided some definitions. We talked a little bit about building height as a proxy for popular culture. And then we also talked a little bit about ideas like localization and the global local continuum. Talked about how architecture can be used to blend one place into another, and how planning can also be used in much the same way, right, to create that sense of placelessness or to maintain that sense of uniqueness. And we ended by talking a little bit about cultural landscapes of local cultures by looking at the Mormon landscape in the American West. So if you have any questions, I'd be delighted to hear them. Please just bring them into class, and I will see you the next time we meet.